Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. Let me back with a small print. And today my guest is Lawrence Anton. Lawrence, on this show, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced. So who are you? Where are you based in the world? And what interests you?
Oh, well, thanks for having me on, first of all. It's great to be here. I'm based in London in the UK, and I can do like a brief sort of overview. Around 5 years ago got into animal rights activism, and from that really sort of opened my mind up, because before that I don't think I would describe myself as a curious person. And then that, I sort of learned that I was just very fundamentally wrong about something, about how the world works. And it really blew my mind. And then from that, I became much more open to trying to understand different points of view. And I then came across antinatalism, which is the subject you found me through. And I thought that was a subject that has been really underserved. It's not very well known about, and I thought it was an important thing to talk about. So I started getting engaged in the community, making videos, and and then I find myself here.
Yeah, so what's your day job? So do you have a day job or talk about it? That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, no, I do. I work for a big education company. I won't say which one, but yeah, I work for a big education company, and I basically sort of project manage the back end of assessments that, students do. Yeah, it's not it's not insanely interesting.
Perfect. Well, anyway, I found you, I think it was a rebuttal that you made into a YouTube video based on the Default Wisdom blog post that was about really pushing back against the idea of antinatalism. So that's just for context as to where we found you. Thought that was very interesting because it's very aligned with the producers of this show and their general philosophy in the world. And I just wanted to get your perspective right to start off with. How would you define antinatalism? This is a very controversial topic right out of the gate. Let's first of all make sure that we are debating or at least talking about the same thing.
Yeah, so you've sort of handed me the shovel to dig my own grave there, but
All right.
So yeah, I guess like the most basic way of that I would define it is just that you view creating sentient life as bad, basically, as it's not a good thing that sentient life comes into the world. Now, some people do restrict that to just humans. I don't. I just think it's unfortunate that any sort of sensitive being comes into the world, and the core reason behind that is that they have the capacity to suffer, basically. So if you wanted to boil it right down, I think that's basically what it is. And then a very common, although even this is somewhat debatable, but a very common then prescription of that is that people should then not, reproduce. We shouldn't be breeding farm animals, as we do. And then there's also debates around whether we should then, intervene in what people call nature to sort of help wild animals and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's a sort of a basic way of the lay of the land.
So would it be incredibly wrong for me to say, for people that are not familiar with the subject, this is basically the argument that almost every teenager has given their parent at some point in their life, saying, I never asked to be born. I didn't ask to be here. Like,
yeah.
This would be my problem.
Exactly, yeah. And they've been listening to too much Morrissey and the Smiths.
Yeah, exactly. So the argument is really an argument about minimizing suffering. And the easiest way to minimize suffering is for there to be no opportunity for suffering, because the only way there is suffering is through some degree of sentience, or at least the ability to feel. Would that be a reasonable thing?
I think maybe some people would maybe nitpick as to whether I think basically like the overarching thing is to minimize suffering. But I think maybe some people would nitpick and say there are some cases where suffering is not really the primary thing. But I think by and large, yeah, you're correct. Yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the other arguments then for antinatalism if suffering might be the a commonly used one. What are some of the other arguments for antinatalism or for having less babies, whether they be human babies or animal babies?
Yeah, well, so one, they all relate to suffering. It's just suffering is not the primary thing of concern. So one sort of argument that a lot of antinatalists are sympathetic with is just about consent. So if you, one way I guess I can explain it is that if you are making any sort of a big decision in your life, right? If that's, buying a house or, a range of other things, you want to lay everything out on the table and go, okay, what are the pros of this, the decision I could make, and what are the cons? And you want to really mull this over in your head and then make a decision, yourself. And then if the decision goes wrong, you're the one who pays the consequences. Hopefully it's not someone else. And I think that's generally how people think that we should make our decisions. But when it comes to procreation, obviously the person can't, before someone exists, they don't exist. And so it's impossible for someone to be able to weigh up the pros and cons of existence, which does seem like something you should be able to do. I mean, we all have a massive amount of hardship in our life. Once we exist as well, we have good times. But life does seem like something that you should be able, it seems like a really important thing that, I should be able to weigh up the pros and cons of this and then decide for myself if I want to take that risk as to whether the life is going to be worth it for me or not. But obviously that's impossible to do. And so one of the things that antinatalists say is, well, actually, given that we can't get consent for imposing this sort of balance of pros and cons on people, maybe we shouldn't be making that decision for someone else, because if it does backfire, we're not going to be the ones that pay the price for that. It's going to be the person we create, and it could backfire very horribly.
Yeah, it's like it seems very unfair that life is an opt-out, not an opt-in condition, right? I mean, that's just
yeah, exactly. Especially when the opt-out is not just you click your fingers and then it's all over. We live in a world where for the vast majority of people, if you want to opt out, it's usually through quite a gruesome way, which I don't think is very fair on people at all. But also it's not just you affect when you opt out. I mean, once we're born, we're caught in this sort of complex web of interactions, relationships that we have with other people. And so once we're born, it tends to be that other people get very attached to us, whether that's our parents, our siblings, our friends, etc. And so if we do at some point decide to opt out, we're not the only person that is going to impact as well. And so we're put in this position where even if we hate the condition, actively hate the condition that we've been put into, which actually I don't consider myself that case. I think my life is actually relatively good. But if you are in that situation, you decide to opt out, you're forced into a situation where you're hurting other people to alleviate your own condition.
Yeah, so in general, when I've heard arguments about antinatalism, at least the ones that have made sensationalist newspaper headlines and all the rest of it, they frame quite differently to the way you framed it. And that's why I wanted to give you the opportunity to frame it going in. You framed it very much around the individual and the person who is alive, not necessarily being in that person being born's individual interest. So you framed it from quite an individual perspective. And then, of course, those around them, as you've spoken about. But quite often the argument is presented around more sort of collectivist or holistic or nature-orientated reasons, saying that essentially sentient life is more destructive to other forms of life and flourishing as a more holistic point of view. So it's more like the obligation to the planet, to nature as a whole, to the universe in general, that we are more trouble than we are worth. What are your views around that argument? Because it's obviously an argument that's linked very closely to climate change and sustainability and a lot of policy, the subtext of government saying people should have less children because less children is better for us or for the planet. Like this can go back to the sort of very genesis sort of arguments of the Chinese government, or even going back further in time into all those other examples that we're familiar with. Is this a valid argument in your view, or is it something that you personally don't find necessary given the argument you've already laid out?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly on the government thing, one thing I want to quickly note is I'm sort of I'm really not a fan of government getting involved in, well, especially like a procreative decision. So for anyone listening who's not familiar with this, it's not the case that antinatalists just, as soon as we get any form of power, which I'm not sure we ever will because it's such a small fringe thing, but we're then going to legislate and like ban all these sorts of whatever. So and a lot of antinatalists are like that. There's sort of this I think healthy repulsion away from totalitarian thinking, although like in any movement, like in the environmental or other movements, there are people who have totalitarian leanings, but yeah, I'm not one of them, and I don't think it's insanely common, but it's a community that hasn't really been surveyed, so we don't know. But anyway, so moving on to the environmental stuff. So yeah, I know quite a few people who have this sort of opinion. I think maybe the most famous person is maybe Les Knight, who started the voluntary human extinction movement. I'm not the biggest fan of this point of view for a couple of reasons. The first one, there's sort of value reasons and then there's like practical reasons. So the core value reason is that I just don't agree with it. So I do agree that humans have been, can be, and will likely be in the future very destructive to other forms of sentient life, right? So this is whether we just bring them into existence just basically to torture and then kill like we do in farms and other laboratories, and also animals that live in the wild as well. We don't have the best track record with interacting with them, but I think so I agree with them on that point of view, that humans don't have the best track record. But the reason I don't agree on sort of like a value level is that I also think that if we were to just follow that instinct of humans are causing this sort of harm, and therefore we should basically just sort of pull the plug, go extinct, and let animals inherit the earth, I think it sort of comes somewhat from a rosy view of nature. I think especially, well, obviously animals in farms wouldn't exist if humans weren't around, but wild animals still would exist. And I think they are in an awful situation. And the only species around that can help them is humans. And so I am more of the opinion that although I don't like the fact that, humans are brought into existence, because I think it harms us, I think the key issue that we should be focusing on at the moment is working towards helping wild animals. And I think the view that you were just talking about, it's in conflict with that. So that's the value point. Then very quickly on the practical point, I think talking about procreation from an environmental point of view is very tricky, and I try to avoid it. Just being that it's very vulnerable to attacks of eco-fascism, like I've been saying, this totalitarian sort of mindset. And also, I think it's just the climate and the environment is a very complicated system, and labeling one act of procreation as saying, if you do that act, it has this net negative impact on other beings. I think one, it's very hard to do that because the systems that you're talking about interacting with are extremely complicated. But also, if you're just looking environmentally, someone can have a kid and have this bad impact that you're claiming they have, but they can also do other things to offset that. And so they can overall have maybe a positive impact on the environment through campaigning or something like that. So I think that sort of argument is very complex, and it gets very murky, and then it also sometimes leans into totalitarianism. So I prefer to avoid it, because I think just talking about the ethics of it is a cleaner conversation often.
Yeah, I mean, there's two very different arguments that have been outlined there now between the two of us. The one is that sentience is not a good idea for the sentient. In other words, life is not necessarily the best choice for you, and very different arguments saying that you are not the best choice for life, because that, as you say, does lead into the totalitarian-esque quite quickly. And of course, it begs the hypothetical question that we always get to very quickly in these points, which is if there's too many people or if people shouldn't be here, you go first. So who has this? But you make another point there that's the whole sort of environmentalism, sustainability argument kind of eats its own tail, in that humans can do then more good for nature as a whole, can do better to fix some of, as you sort of alluded to, which you can get into in a second, the whole idea that nature itself, life, whatever life it is, whether it's animal, human, plant, whatever, is nasty, brutish, and short, right? The state of nature is not a particularly pleasant place to be. And in fact, the sentient human life might be the only way to escape that cycle, right? But then, of course, we come back to your original argument that life is not necessarily the best journey for you, the individual, because that argument leads to the sort of subtext, or begs the question that if you are born, you then have an obligation to deal with this. And that's, of course, just another reason for why you don't necessarily want to be part of this project, because suddenly the very act of being here means that you're kind of stuck in this, you have an obligation to fix the problem around you, which not everyone necessarily wants. Again, it's that opt-out, no opt-in kind of clause to that, which is a bit of a circular logic on both sides. But I think it's an interesting way to look at this whole thing, that a lot of the sort of environmental questions, given actual sentience, say that just by existing, which is something you don't have by choice, you are obligated to do X, Y, and Z, which is actually very close to religious arguments for sentience, right? I mean, this goes back to holy books all over the place, that being born is a set of obligations that if you don't fulfill, you will be condemned to some sorts of unpleasant eternity or infinite reincarnation loop, right? Which goes right back to your argument to say, why should we be obligated to participate in these games and processes and submit to these rules and these forms of morality that we didn't actually opt into in the first place? I don't know if you have any views on how religion falls into this, but I'm always curious about that, because I think that so much of our beliefs do drive our ideas of right and wrong, firstly, if they even exist at all. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to continue that thread.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to religion, I don't have any super developed thoughts. So if anyone's looking for those, then I'm not going to be providing them. I was raised in an atheist household. The UK is not necessarily a very religious country. I mean, legally, we still are officially a religious country, but it doesn't play a very important role in the culture generally anymore, although that may change in the future. But so yeah, personally, I have not gone to great depths, even since becoming an antinatalist, to explore the sort of intersection between ethics and religion. The only thing I would say is that there are quite a few religious antinatalists. I'm not sure if there is a more of a disposition towards that in some religions. I would suspect maybe a decent amount of Buddhists are, because it seems that Buddhism does align a lot more with antinatalist thinking than maybe other religions do. But there are things in Christianity that some people appeal to and say that we shouldn't procreate for those reasons as well. But for me personally, I am just not really a fan of religion generally, and it really irritates me when people use it as a justification to impose something on others, and I see life as an imposition, and so people generally use their religion to impose life on someone else, even though they don't see it like that, obviously. That's just from my point of view. But yeah, I would say that's probably the extent of my thoughts on the religious topic, but it is actually something that I want to actively look into on my own channel, because I want to get some religious antinatalists on to talk about their perspective, because I think it's interesting, but it's also important, because I realize I live in a bit of a bubble. The vast majority of the world is very religious, so it's important to talk about antinatalism and how it relates to different sort of the main religions around the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and there, of course, it's would be interesting to unpack the difference between antinatalism, the idea of not wanting to procreate, and the idea of celibacy, which is de facto antinatalism, but for rather different reasons. But you get to the same point. It's the sort of discontinuation of your particular line, but for quite different reasons. But for me, I think the religious argument, or any sort of form of religion, just deepens your initial argument, because religion, basically by definition, is a set of obligations on someone that is sentient that they don't opt into, right? And it's not just the obligation to be alive, it's the obligation to live in a certain way, to conform to certain rules and regulations. And I think it's an interesting way to look at this topic going forward. So if you do come up with further ideas, do let us know. We could probably continue that conversation there.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say as well is that depending on your religion, at least in your head, because I don't believe any of these things are true, but if you were someone who believed a specific religion was true and they had some sort of a concept of an afterlife that could, you could go into an afterlife that is amazing, the traditional one, at least in the West, is heaven, or you could go into an afterlife that is a form of punishment and is really bad, like hell, which again, is the popular one in the West. So I think that's another thing that is quite interesting about the connection between antinatalism and religion, in that if you do believe there's some sort of afterlife that someone could go to where it's very horrible and it can be for eternity, at least in your mind, the stakes for procreation are way higher than it would be in my mind as someone who doesn't think that there is that form of afterlife.
Yeah, you've articulated that a lot better. So next topic, leading on from religion, which I don't think is too big a jump, maybe you'll think it's a larger leap than I do, is basically the intersection between your worldview and what's happening now with developments with AI and potentially sentient AI and all talk of a singularity, which everyone's gone a bit crazy about at the moment. But it's not very far from any conversation about AI that we start talking about AI gods and all the rest of it, which is very related to some sort of artificial sentience. Or I suppose if it does become sentient, it's not artificial anymore either, but that's just semantics, although it does annoy me slightly in these debates. But the idea that I wanted to get to with you is that as an antinatalist, should we be pursuing sentient or super intelligence, artificial intelligence?
It's an interesting one. So my general thoughts are no, because it's a form of sentient life that will presumably be able to suffer. Although it's an interesting one. If you listen to someone like David Pearce, for example, for anyone that doesn't know, he's a transhumanist, and basically transhumanism is essentially trying to manipulate humans on the genetic level generally, but also with technology, so that essentially we abolish suffering, or we reach some sort of, people call it like the transhumanist utopia, which maybe is a bit of a meme now, but I think people get what I mean. We get to a point where society is blissful and amazing, and we've got there through genetic manipulation and technology. So if you would speak to someone like David Pearce, he sort of espouses the view of, so he is personally an antinatalist, but he thinks it's basically a sort of a failing concept. It's never going to catch on. It's not going to do the good in the world that he thinks it can do. But there is a plan B, which is you can deal with the problem of suffering without, you can basically decouple sentience from suffering is his point. And that could be true. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I hope it's true. If it is true, I think, that's also an amazing avenue to pursue, even though, for maybe nitpicky reasons, I think just never existing is better. But it's a good avenue to pursue, given that antinatalism probably isn't going to catch on ever in any big way. But relating this back to artificial intelligence is that it could be the case that we're able to develop sentient AI that cannot suffer, right? So it could be, I don't know if you'd call it like a transhumanist AI, because it's not human. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe someone's going to pick me up in the comments about, what even is a human, and get all like Blade Runner on me or something. But Yeah, it could. My gut feeling basically is I wouldn't like that to happen, but I also understand the nuances of like, well, it could be a sentient AI that couldn't suffer, and then actually, is there a antinatalist problem with that? My without thinking about it in an amazing amount of detail, if they couldn't suffer, it may not be an issue inherently. And an AI, could go to, if you have all the correct sort of issues ironed out, where it's not going to turn around and start some new AI genocide or something, but it actually plays out well. The AI could have a lot of really good extrinsic benefits. Like we were saying before, how even though it's sad that humans are created and we do a lot of harm now, it could be in the future that we can go on to help like wild animals, and the same case could be made for this AI, that actually developing it could be a good thing in terms of it being us being able to harness it in a way, or it just being able to do it itself, to bring a lot of, or do a lot of good in the world basically. And if we're able to develop this AI in a way that it doesn't suffer but it is still sentient, then I guess that would be even better. But having said all that, it's a very like complicated and tricky topic that could backfire in so many different ways. So I'm still hesitant about it as well, because once we open that can or box or whatever the saying is on sentient AI, and we're not able to decouple suffering from that, well, then you could potentially create an infinite number of sentient beings, way beyond the number that exist at the moment, that can all suffer in some horrible way, potentially even more than humans experience. So, yeah, mixed thoughts, but I err on the side of a bit like, yeah, so.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Or to sort of ask a more explicit sort of antinatalist riddle there. If sentience and super artificial intelligence could not be decoupled, in other words, if in order to get super intelligence, it would have to come part and parcel with the suffering sort of side effect we have right now, would that be still a good thing to do from a bit of a utilitarian perspective, if that super intelligence suffering was able to eliminate suffering for the rest of us lesser intelligences, humans and animals included? And as sort of as a subsection sort of riddle to go with that, is human sentience coupled with its suffering perhaps still a net good if we are able to use it to eliminate the suffering of all the lesser intelligences? And I use that sort of with inverted commas because
I get what you mean.
Got a value on any particular form of life or intelligence, but the ones that are blessed / cursed with less intelligence and suffering, because they do seem to coat together. So I don't know, how would you answer that, right? Would it be a good, or is our, and it's basically the same question, saying, is our existence worth it if we are able to suffering for the rest of the universe? And therefore that you'd have to answer in a very similar way, whether creating a more higher intelligence with greater suffering would still be worth it. I don't even know if I'm asking that in a sense, in a way that makes sense, but
no, I get you. I do think the questions are slightly different, but it might be a difference without any sort of distinction. But before I get to answering those two, just about when you were talking about, I know you said this isn't the term you would like to use, but lesser forms of sentience or whatever. It's interesting with I assume you were sort of referring to non-human animals and stuff, and I get what you mean. I don't refer to them as a lesser form as well, but I understand what you meant.
Yeah, that was wrong phrasing, but you get the point, right?
Yeah, I get the point. Yeah. I think it really depends when you get to non-human animals on the situation, because like I admit that there does seem to be a wider range of negative experiences that humans can experience. Like we have, well, for example, humans, they get anxiety and maybe even depression, or negative feelings towards some sort of sense of impending doom for their species. You see this a lot in the environmental movement. A lot of people have this eco anxiety sort of, or extinction anxiety, I don't know how you would put it, which I don't think has really been shown to in any other species, right? So there's clearly some forms of suffering that we can experience that other animals probably can't. But the depth of suffering that other animals can experience could, in many cases, be more than a human. And one example, I heard it somewhere, but I can't remember where I heard it. So this isn't an original analogy, but one example is, imagine if you take a 5-year-old maybe, or maybe a 6-7-year-old or whatever, to the dentist. They're not going to enjoy that experience. They're going to have metal tools and stuff in their mouth. But, the dentist can also say, I'm going to give you a lollipop after this. You can also help the child contextualize the suffering and all this sort of stuff to alleviate it in some way. But if you took a pig to the dentist, you would not be able to contextualize that suffering in the same way, right? And because all they would know is just like, there's this guy with a mask on his face trying to get metal things in my mouth. So it would be the same experience in terms of physically what is happening in the dentist chair. But the pig, I would argue, would probably suffer way more than your average child, just because they don't have this ability. They're maybe less intelligent, as someone would say. So I think it's complicated with animals. Sometimes they do suffer more, sometimes they suffer less. It depends on the situation. But going back to your original question with about AI being used to help sentient life generally, or humans being used, so I think they are slightly separate questions. Just that the way that I frame it, as I said before, is like, I'm not a fan of bringing humans into the world, but I'm also not a fan of bringing animals into the world. And it seems to me like bringing animals into the world is a way bigger problem than bringing humans into the world. And the main reasons for that are, one, there's just way more animals than there are humans. They generally tend to have much worse lives on average, way worse lives. And also animals, generally, there are some nuanced examples where they can do this, but generally they don't have the capacity to, once they exist, make the world a better place for others in any sort of intentional way. Now, obviously, you can have, companion animals that make your life better and stuff, but that's maybe not them sort of setting out on their life to, I'm going to make the world a better place. It's just them having a relationship with someone. And so for those reasons, I think, even though both are unfortunate, human procreation and animals being brought into existence, I think the bigger thing to focus on is animals, at least at the moment. And the way that I think this is relevant to your question is that I think, because you asked about, is it worth bringing humans into existence so that we can have this greater impact? And I tend not to frame it like that. Maybe someone is going to accuse me of, oh, he's just sort of reframing and it doesn't really make a massive difference. But I think the way I view human procreation is, it's sort of the lesser of two evils, and it's going to be happening anyway. Like, human procreation is not going to stop, right? It's going to be continuing. Our population will keep going up for at least some time. And so I just say it's not our priority. Sure, we can view it as a bad thing for the humans being brought into existence, but it's not where we should be paying our attention to, right? Whereas I think AI is slightly different. It's not the case that AI is being brought into existence and we can just simply not have it as no, we have to actively pursue it because it doesn't exist yet, at least to my knowledge. And so I think they're slightly different in that sort of way in the framing. But to get to the core of your point, should we be bringing about a sentient AI that can suffer so that it can then hopefully go on to alleviate the suffering of others? It depends how big the impact is, to be honest. I think you do have to be utilitarian about it. If you can create a sentient AI that can suffer, but it doesn't actually suffer that much, but the benefits are just massive, then yeah, it does conflict with my antinatalism. Although, maybe you could argue not, because it would actually result in more lives never existing. But yeah, I would probably be in support of bringing the AI into existence, just because, it's like if someone came up to me and said, if you don't have a kid now, I'm going to drop a bomb on, I don't know, Uganda. Like, I'm going to have the kid, it's like, I'm not going to be so ideological and dogmatic so that I allow someone to drop a nuclear bomb on a city in some other country, you know, because it's just like the amount of harm is so much more intense. And even though I do think it's a bad thing for this act that I, you know, would then engage in, bringing this kid into the world, is a harm to the child, it just avoids so much more harm. It's basically just like a trolley problem on steroids, isn't it? So I think I would take the same approach with AI. Where is that boundary on, you know, how much harm is acceptable? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, to be honest. If people are being honest, I don't think anyone would be able to come up with an exact line. So yeah, I don't know if that is too vague an answer for you, but that's my general thoughts on it.
Okay, so a similar question. Would you consider yourself to be an evangelical antinatalist that wants to actively change people's minds about bringing people into the world and using essentially people or sentience, whatever it is, as means rather than ends in and of themselves? Or would you say that it is something that is entirely a personal choice, right? Because I'm quite interested in these ideas of choice, because we all have choice, but we do understand that we are manipulable creatures, right? So we do have power over persuading other people through argument. Again, that's a very human thing at the moment, that we're the only ones that can change your mind and you override your instincts through argument. Is it something that you consider yourself as to be a moral duty to persuade other people to change their minds on this issue, or is it something you feel quite agnostic about?
I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's a moral duty, but I think it's a good thing. You know, I think if you believe that there is something going on in the world that is doing a lot of harm and you think is wrong, then yeah, spend a decent amount of your time trying to change that. I don't think we should all just be sat on the sofa watching Netflix and consuming. Like, I think given we do exist, for the people that have the capacity to do so, we should be putting effort into making the world a better place, and that can be in a variety of ways. You know, like, you know, there are many issues out there that need attention, and so I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's a moral duty, but I strongly encourage people to do that. And it doesn't have to be about antinatalism. There are many other, you know, worthy topics. There, you know, I think there are some topics that are more important than others. But if it's a choice between someone advocating for some other cause and just not doing anything, then I'd say advocate for that other cause that is going to make the world a better place. You know, some people just aren't, you know, I have friends who they are diehard antinatalists, but they just don't have a passion for doing activism in this area. And so they decide to focus on other causes. And I think that's completely fine. I am, you know, mostly I'm also very compelled by you know, making the world a better place for animals, and I see my antinatalist activism as being part of that. But I used to campaign more about you know, like on the street outreach around animal rights. But I feel antinatalism is sort of, there can be more gains made there because there's less people focusing on it. So I think it's, at least for me, a better place to spend my time. So yeah, I would say I would label myself evangelical, even though, I mean, I wouldn't use that term, but given it's the one you use, like I would accept the label. But yeah, I don't know if I'd go as strong as to say that it's a moral duty. But yeah, I would strongly encourage anyone who has the capacity to put their mind and effort into making the world a better place. Yeah.
So I'm going to make an assumption here, and you're free to, of course, correct me if it's not, in fact, but your stance on things. And essentially, I want to get to the point around the whole sort of what's the highest value we should be optimizing for. So listening to what you've said, it sounds like we should be optimizing to minimize suffering. Other guests we've had on the show said that our highest moral objective should actually be to maximize intelligence. In fact, quite a lot of very intelligent people working in the domain of like artificial intelligence at the moment are saying that intelligence is something we should be optimizing. So if that's would you agree that that's not your stance, that overall optimizing for greater intelligence is not necessarily the greatest good, and again in inverted commas?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what people would mean by maximizing for intelligence. But no, I would say if maximizing intelligence was going to then further the cause of, you know, reducing suffering in the world, then yeah, I would support it as a means to an end, but I don't think maximizing intelligence for me would be the end goal in and of itself. No.
Yeah, so the argument there essentially goes that we should pursue building artificial intelligence that could supersede us altogether as a species and sort of do ourselves out of existence, which is kind of an antinatalist argument too, but from a very different perspective, in the pursuit of pursuing something greater than ourselves. So the reason I ask that is that if intelligence isn't the thing that we need to be maximizing for, that of course opens up the conversation around other forms of intelligence and of other creatures that might not have as high IQs as human beings, or perhaps sort of artificial intelligence would have, which gets back to the duty that we as the higher intelligence have over the species that don't have that sort of human grade IQ or intelligence level. And the argument there that I'm getting to is that then the moral worth between people with different artificial or different degrees of intelligence, which is of course the very uncomfortable subtext, people that do agree maximizing for intelligence, higher intelligence equals higher value. There's obviously a gradient between human beings themselves. There's obviously then a huge gradient between human beings and other species, right? So that would be at least logically consistent with the argument that you've outlaid there. The moral worth, or the worth in general of different species and different forms of life, is not determined by intelligence grade, but rather by capacity to feel, to love, to suffer, or something else. Yeah. In which case, what I'm getting to is, what is our duty as higher intelligence bestowed beings to beings that don't have that degree of intelligence, just the basic capability? What does that capability obligate us to or not? Because again, I've started this conversation talking about the unfairness of any sort of obligation at all when you are born into a position that you don't have much choice over. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it is an interesting one, because I do think it's like you were saying, you know, it's odd to talk about duties and obligations when you're talking about individuals who had no choice in whether they receive them. But yeah, on a species level, if I'm just talking about humans as a species, again, I guess it does depend what people mean by duty, but I think I would go as far as to say that we do have a duty to help those less fortunate than us on a species level. But also saying that is also kind of odd, because what does it mean for a species to have a duty when the species is just made up of individuals? You know, then do the individuals within that species have a duty? Well, if they don't, then how can the species have one? Because if no one as an individual has that duty, and they simply say, well, I'm not going to be the one that does that, then, well, then do we then force people in the species to do that? Because the species as a whole has. So I think when it comes to duty, I would like it to be as simple as saying humans do have a duty to help others that, you know, can suffer but can't alleviate it themselves, because we have this enhanced capacity for problem solving, innovation, this sort of stuff. And then did you ask what form that would take?
No, the second part of the question was more, what duty do we have to the other, as individuals or as a whole? What even if that might not be the best way to ask it. So it's like, if it's not duty, which you have covered, the whole idea of duty towards different form of being, it would be a case of what would be the moral good that we could do, should we choose to do it, towards species that can't help themselves the same way that we can, that do have a capacity, as you said, to suffer.
Yeah.
So what should we be doing about wildlife, about other animals at the moment? Should we be detonating the entire planet and, solving the problem once and for all in a very quick and painless manner? Or what can we be doing at the moment from your perspective? That was a very
cool. So you mean like practical things that we can be doing?
Or ideologically first, then practically. I think ideologically is the more important question. Okay. Speaking, like, should we be sterilizing animals? Like, I know in parts of Africa now we're sterilizing elephants so we don't have to cull them later, and also they don't starve to death when we run out of space for them. Should we be having less of ourselves? Is the ideological best path forward to have less human beings so that the rest of nature can carry on as it is? Or philosophically speaking, is it our, again, the word duty is probably the wrong word. Is it moral good for us to interfere in the state of nature? So there's eliminating the deliberate suffering we're causing is, of course, one thing, which I'm sure you'll get to, like stop factory farming animals, stop torturing chickens. Like, we could that's quite an obvious way to start. But where does the philosophical question start and stop for you as to what the good thing or the right thing or the noble thing or the duty is for us as the more capable species towards the others?
Yeah, okay, I get what you mean. Well, I think so.
Interfere in reducing harm elsewhere. Where along that spectrum do you sit?
So starting with the ideological part, I think ideologically the sort of thing that and my thinking has evolved on this, obviously, like I said before, I used to be a non-vegan natalist, very much so, and then I've gone through this moral evolution. I've got to the point I am now, and I'm sure I will continue. In a year's time, maybe all of this will be irrelevant, and I won't believe it. I don't know. But yeah, so
in your journey.
So yeah, ideologically, at this point in time, I think that the best thing we can be doing is pursuing alleviating the suffering of others who already exist, and then trying to move the world into a direction where less individuals come into existence. And I think the main sort of camps that we would be focusing on are, like you said, the obvious one would be stop doing the intentional direct harm like factory farming and other forms of animal exploitation, but then also with wild animals as well. So obviously there are animals that already exist. Well, not okay, humans are animals, but there are human animals, non-human animals that already exist, and many of them are in awful situations, and those individuals demand some sort of attention now if we can give it to them. But also and there are also ones that will come into existence in the future, whether we like it or not, and we should also prepare to make to essentially ease the burden of existence for them as well, try and make it as little a burden as possible. But we can also focus on what some people have referred to as like wildlife antinatalism or animal antinatalism. Magnus Vinding wrote a book, which I am going to butcher the name of now, but it's called something along the lines of The Speciesism of Leaving Nature Alone, the Theoretical Case for Wildlife Antinatalism, something like that. If you type those buzzwords into Google, it will come up. Yeah, and I think he makes a decent case in that book about why one sort of key thing we should be focusing on in terms of making the world a better place is aiming towards wildlife antinatalism. Essentially, humans have problems. We should deal with those problems. We should obviously stop doing the intentional harm of bringing animals into existence and just torturing them for basically no reason. But there's also this issue that is not the fault of humans. Like wild animals were here before humans were. It's not our fault they're here. Now, obviously, we do harm them in some ways, but the fundamental problem they face is not human caused. It's just part of what we label nature.
Nature's not nice.
Exactly. Yeah. I can't remember who said it, but someone said, if Mother Nature was an actual mother, that they would be put down they would be arrested or something, because they're just like psychotic. Again, I probably butchered that quote as well, but yeah. So I think ideologically that is what we should be doing, is pursuing never existing as a means of helping others, particularly wild animals and etc. Practically, what can we do as a species at the moment? Well, I think at the moment, so practically what we can be doing is trying to improve the quality of life and the standard of living for humans, but probably not pay too much attention to human procreation in for the time being, because I don't think it's our main priority. But obviously, we should be
not subsidize births like they're doing in parts of the world that want more of the right type of baby, don't want to encourage immigration in order to keep their economic debt Ponzi scheme economies alive. That was a very naughty thing for me to say, but
yeah, no, well, there's a lot of countries pursuing that. I saw an article today about in South Korea, they may start well, I think they're already putting in incentives, but I think they're maybe thinking of ramping them up. And I don't know too much about the public policy side of things, but I've heard that these policies haven't been too successful. But who knows, that may change in the future. I don't know where these policies are going to go, but yeah. So obviously humans should have good lives. We should accommodate for that. We should stop doing the things that we do to domesticated animals. I think the practical things we can do for that are fairly obvious. Things, technological innovations like lab grown meat, but also just people boycotting these industries and stuff. There are sort of very clear things that individual people can do to remove their participation. And then also there are sort of established organizations that are already up and running that they can maybe work for or volunteer for, or send money to, or they can set up their own organization, whatever. When it comes to wild animals, it's much more complicated because we are not usually causing their problems. I mean, we do in some ways in our interactions, but they have a lot of problems just in and of themselves. And the systems that they interact with each other in are insanely complicated. And so any form of any project that we set out on doing to help them could have potential like backfire effects. They could go massively wrong. I don't know if you've heard of the Cobra effect. Yeah, exactly. Just for anyone that's listening, the Cobra effect is essentially when you intend to do something, but the actions you take to do it actually cause the opposite effect and make the problem worse. And it was from when the British were in India, they wanted to get rid of a certain type of snake, and so they told the locals, okay, well, if you bring, say, the head of a snake or whatever of this species to us, we will give you some money, hoping that people would go out and kill all the snakes. But actually people just started breeding the snakes, killing them and bringing them for money. The British found this out and then stopped putting a bounty on the snake's head. So people released the snakes because they couldn't make money anymore. And so there were way more snakes than exactly. So it just went horribly wrong. But we could do the same sort of thing when it comes to wild animals, so we've got to be very careful about this. So I think at this point, the main thing I think that we should be doing is researching, basically trying to understand the systems that wild animals live in much more. So we know how they work much more. We can much more accurately predict what potential backfires could happen, how we can mitigate for those, etc., etc. But there are also initiatives already going on where we are helping wild animals. There are vaccination efforts and the like, and just even individual people around the world often help wild animals that they see in need, on a relatively small scale. But the other day I saw a bird that had I was volunteering at an animal sanctuary, and we saw a bird that had I think they had like flown into something and just not completely knocked themselves out, and they were in a lot of pain. So the owners of the sanctuary sort of took them in and tried to look after them. Unfortunately, they did die, but that's an example where we can maybe interact with wild animals on an individual level and try and help them out if we can. But there are future projects that we can aim for. I have been reading about some hopefully promising things recently that are essentially putting wildlife antinatalism into practice. So I'm sure anyone who lives in a city around the world knows what a pigeon or a crow or a rat is. They are basically in any city around the world in massive numbers. Generally, they tend to be cold if in population control, poisoned or trapped in some other way. But one promising technology is to control their populations by using contraception. So you don't have this boom and bust cycle of these populations, but it can be kept relatively level using contraception, so that you don't have all these individuals brought into existence, so that they can just, survive for a bit and then be killed off in probably a relatively painful way. But they can just never come into existence.
You'd be pro interventions, small scale interventions to minimize the sort of proliferation of wildlife, but not necessarily being too dramatic at this point in time.
Yeah, basically, because I think I mean, there are other people who are much more qualified to speak on this than me. I'm sort of like I'm
more curious on the sort of ideological level rather than the practical intervention. As you said, there are massive sort of, unintended consequences that can go wrong with sorts of things. But in terms of ideologically speaking, you would be open to some sorts of intervention in the quantity of wildlife creatures.
I think that's what we should be doing. One analogy I've used before, and I don't know if this is original to me or if I heard it somewhere, but if there was, if you were part of some sort of group that went out and came across another group who were in need, maybe you'd gone out hiking or something, you'd taken loads of supplies, and there was another group, you'd never interacted with them, none of their problems you'd caused, but you came across them and they'd been stranded somewhere or injured or whatever, and they were in need of your help. Now, you've not caused any of their problems, like we haven't caused, the problems of wild animals to in a general sense. But if you come across someone who's in a really bad situation, I think that we should help them. If you were out hiking and you saw a group of people in need and you could help them in some way, or in the long run you could help them, and you decide to just walk on, to me that's not the right thing to do. I think we should be concerned about the things that others are going through, even though we haven't caused it, and we should seek to help them.
That's a very good point. Do you have any closing comments before we end this off? Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And if there's anything, the way that we can continue this conversation, we'll probably be in touch going forward. And of course, anything that you referred to, we will put into the links for everyone listening to this to get into in greater detail. But otherwise, just where can people find you if they're interested in this debate, if they're interested in joining your sort of movement or just becoming part of your general circle of orbit? Where can people find you?
Yeah, well, again, thanks so much for having me on. And if there are any of the links you need, I can email them over. But if people want to find any of the things I do, they can just type Lawrence Anton into YouTube. You should be able to find my channel. There will be links in the description to my Twitter. Those are the two sort of public places that I put stuff out on, where you can sort of follow anything that I'm doing. I think those are basic. I got, working on some other projects in the background, but they're not really public at the moment. But if you want to find out about those, go on the Twitter and YouTube and you'll find out about them in the future.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.